I'm Elise Orlowski, a senior video director here at Kramer.
And I'm Trip Underwood, a creative director at Kramer.
And at Kramer, we work with so many incredibly fascinating people from all over multiple industries.
We have so many great conversations, many that are just too good to keep to ourselves. So now we're sharing them with the world.
Right here from Kramer Studios.
This is Pivot Points.
Cut.
Hey!
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
Back in the studio.
Yep.
So I'm super excited about today's episode.
Yeah.
It
What are we talking about?
We're talking about, talk about who we're talking to is actually the important part. But today we have the privilege of talking with Theresa McNeely, who is the Chief Communications Officer and Patient Advocate at Homology Medicines, an amazing organization. They're really at the forefront of developing this kind of new wave of medicines that's using this growing understanding of disease biology, gene therapy, and gene editing technologies.
Oh, cool.
Super advanced stuff.
Wow.
And it's actually helping to treat and potentially cure some of the world's most challenging and rare genetic diseases. Theresa herself has decades of experience in the healthcare and patient communications, which is a subject that's near and dear to my heart because you might not know, but back in the mid 2000s, before I got here at Kramer, I was head writer at Boston Children's Hospital.
Right. I remember you telling me about that.
So it was an awesome time. It was a great job, and it really gave me this like front row seat to that institution's first foray into the use of social media, which was very exciting, but also a very uncertain time because there's HIPAA things to consider, there's patient privacy to consider, all the things that social media, putting yourself out there in the world, everything it does well, doesn't always jibe with patient privacy.
Right.
However,
it has to be a lot more strategic.
Exactly. But open lines of communications between patients, between researchers, between caregivers, between advocate groups, that's super important. So the crux is, how can we kind of capitalize on social media's ability to connect people while still being very, very thoughtful and careful about things like privacy and factual information, as we all know, is not necessarily the best thing about social media.
Right.
So Theresa knows all this stuff incredibly well, and I'm super excited to pick her brain on that topic and a couple of different things. So I think let's bring her to the show.
Yeah,
Theresa,
welcome.
welcome.
Her.
Thank you. Thanks, Trip, and thanks, Elise. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for coming.
We're looking forward to it.
Yeah.
It sounds like you have a ton of experience. So social media is something I think now more than ever that's really, really important. So especially for communication. So we're excited to kind of pick your brain, especially regarding the healthcare field.
Yeah. And kind of just jumping right in, Theresa, as someone that was working in the healthcare and patient communications field during that social media boom of the early to mid 2000s, what were your thoughts at that time about the ways it allowed patients to kind of communicate with a bigger audience? So patients can talk to patients can talk to researchers or clinical professionals. They can learn about potential trial sites. They can get connected to advocacy organizations and so on. What were your thoughts at that time in terms of this new tool, and any excitement you had and or any reservations you had about it?
I would start by saying for the patient community, it's been one of the best things that has happened. As you mentioned, it's an opportunity for them to connect in many instances in ways that they couldn't before. They didn't even know people like them were having the same challenges they were, potentially had the same diseases. So it was a really powerful tool. It also gave them comfort in being able to do things they couldn't do before. For example, educate other patients, form patient advocacy groups, raise money, go to regulators, help them understand what they're dealing with on a daily basis and living with their disease. So again, just like especially on a global basis, because it's in rare diseases, there's so few patients, so finding each other and being able to connect beyond borders was extremely powerful. for healthcare companies, it was a bit scary, to be honest. It presented all sorts of challenges, as you mentioned, with HIPAA regulations. Yeah.
Yep.
So that was difficult, and it also for public companies presented a lot of challenges too, because in a lot of ways it was exposing themselves to having to potentially answer questions from patients in a public forum, and that becomes very tricky when you're trying to maintain confidentiality and so forth.
Right.
So I think healthcare companies were late to the game in some ways in adopting this new forum. But I think they've come a long way. I know we certainly have, and so has the technology. So it's really helped.
Talk to me a little bit about, I understand what it would mean for patients, this idea of finding out you're not the only person in the world dealing with this. One thing I found incredibly powerful was some of the communications I saw between caregivers. Someone that maybe has a sick partner, a sick parent, a sick child, something at home. The way that caregivers could communicate to other caregivers, I thought was very powerful. And just curious if you had any thoughts on that or any examples of seeing that and how that might help them care for their sick one at home.
It's been amazing. And in fact, you see a lot of healthcare companies have broadened their social media presence to include caregivers. In a lot of these diseases, the patients themselves are facing challenges, but they may be unaware, for example, of cognitive or mobility challenges. So being able to not only healthcare companies connect with caregiver communities and help, but also the caregivers being able to share tips for, how to deal with some of the disease manifestations has been incredibly powerful. And I would say in many ways has also helped healthcare companies design clinical trials with caregivers' perspectives in mind, not just the patient. For a very long time, we focused on the patient, and now we've really broadened that out to, patients, their caregivers, including, their physicians, their families, their friends, and I think that's been a real benefit of social media in this regard.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I feel like, social media in general is just about creating communities, whether it's, you like to see little French bulldogs to finding like a really important community when you're dealing with like a very difficult illness. So I just love how that's kind of a universal thing with social media. It's really just about creating communities and finding those connections. So it's awesome that I think for healthcare communities, you guys have been able to utilize that to really help people, not feel alone and feel connected with people in the community.
But the downside being,
there's always a downside.
Cynical that I am, increased connections provides incredibly, not incredible, but it provides opportunity for miscommunication, we'll say.
Okay.
Misinformation.
That totally makes sense.
We understand. So, and I think also for something that's very personal, and Theresa can attest to this, of what works for one patient, for one caregiver is not going to be a universal. It might not work for others, but that doesn't always come through in those kind of communications.
Sure, yeah,
so,
that makes sense.
Theresa, I wonder if you could just kind of shed some light on the downside of these connections and how you've seen in your time in this space how either healthcare companies themselves or people in their communities are working to kind of stop that misinformation campaigns or anything like that where things get lost in translation, we'll say.
Right. And I think one of the things that contributes to that is the speed at which technology is enabling that to happen. So not just the speed, but the reach has been particularly challenging. And it's one of the reasons why we've been trying to educate folks about the downside, particularly in the healthcare space, in, not necessarily oversharing, but perhaps sharing information they shouldn't. And this has been a concerted effort at Homology, and I know other companies are taking on this charge as well. And what we found is that it really is just a lack of awareness on the patient's part, and perhaps the researchers, the clinical researchers, not knowing the downside of the sharing. And a good example of that would be, a patient posting on how well a particular treatment is working or not working. And companies are having to find an avenue for responding, and that usually is not in a social media forum. So it's an interesting conundrum for healthcare companies in that regard. But once we have the opportunity to tell folks about, potentially compromising the integrity of the data of a clinical trial. This is confidential information. As you said, this one patient's experience may not reflect the larger patient population. So we need to be really careful. And when they understand that it can be misused and often abused by other audiences, then they realize and they really do think twice about whether or not something they would have naturally shared with their community. The reason the community was formed was to share and educate each other. But I think that it opens their eyes, and they're very receptive because they know that companies are working really hard to bring new treatments to help patients, caregivers, the community at large.
Talk to me a little bit about the power of social media in terms of recruiting for clinical trials. So, I imagine this is just casting this wide net. I imagine is had to have just completely innovated that process.
Yeah.
And as we know, a good trial is only as good as its data, right? So the larger the sample size, the better the trial. And I imagine the ability to recruit more people has been huge. So just curious as to your thoughts on that, how quickly that's pushed clinical trial recruitment over, and then some of the pitfalls that you are dealing with, because as we discussed, a great tool, but not a perfect tool.
Right. It's been phenomenal in patient recruitment and just general awareness. And a lot of patients, share not only amongst themselves, but the patient advocacy organizations are very involved in the recruitment efforts as well. I don't have to tell you how self-educated patients are today, caregivers are today. So it enables a forum for them to reach out, get more information about trials, come into their physician's office somewhat, more informed than they would have been in the past. Social media has really facilitated knowledge gathering and an empowerment for patients, which is one of the best things that social media has brought to the world, actually. I guess you mentioned what would be the downsides. Again, we go to personal patient experiences in a trial could potentially discourage other people from participating, and their experience may not even be related to the treatment that's being evaluated. So we've seen, patient postings about their experiences, and, it's turned out either they're not on treatment or it's due to, other circumstances rather than the treatment itself. So that gets a bit complicated when that information gets shared and not in the proper context of the totality of data being generated from a clinical trial.
Which is definitely a problem, but it's also not really unique to this particular industry. I think that's kind of the one thing we know about social. Look at Yelp. I had a terrible time here. It didn't work. And I think because we're
And it
all...
just gets pushed up the
It
list.
just- but I think as a society, as we all become just more comfortable and used to social media just being ubiquitous everywhere in our life, I feel like, this is not a clinical trial discussion. I have no data to back this up. I just feel like people are becoming a little bit more savvy about understanding that one person's experience isn't necessarily going to be reflective of their own. So
Yeah, and combing through it too, because I feel
Right.
like to the Yelp example, I'll read one bad review, but then I'll try to like counterweight it with, okay, this person had a good experience, like kind of meet in the
Right.
middle and it makes me do more research than just looking at one thing.
And
kind
if
of
you're
writing it
talking
off.
about something as potentially serious as
Right.
clinical trials, or if you're exploring drugs, a much more educated search than if you're looking for a good place for brunch,
Correct.
which is the
Correct.
kind of pithy analogy I've made.
Yeah.
But I
I
understand.
think to pick up on your example though with Yelp, I mean that's usually tens of thousands of people.
Right.
In clinical trials, it's so few numbers, and then when you think of who might actually post, it could be so few that you actually don't have that big list to scroll down and
true.
figure out, is this real? Is it not? And so I think it becomes more difficult, and you can take that to a whole other level when you're talking about rare disease communities. Because there's even fewer patients. So that one post can just hang out there and that's all you see, and whether or not it's in the right context, the power of that, both good and potentially not so good, is takes it to a whole other level in healthcare.
So how do you I don't want to use the term combat that, because you're
What's
not
the
trying to
remedy?
silence people. Yeah, but what is your role as a communications professional in that field to try to remedy that information that is out there that is not applicable to everybody?
Yeah, I think what we found and other companies have found as well is that being proactive from the beginning. So even before you start a trial, like when you're doing, initial recruiting sites even, or even as soon as your first site visit. So, companies will go and meet with the study coordinators and the principal investigators, and that becomes an opportunity. Even though the informed consents now have evolved as social media, that's what a patient signs when they agree to participate in a clinical trial. There now is language in there that speaks to the confidential nature of the trial from a social media standpoint, and that, asking patients not to share their personal experiences on social media. A lot happens at initial site visit. So we found what helps in that education process is to come in behind, the clinical folks. So communications folks, patient advocacy folks in our organization, we're a team. And we come in and have a conversation with them, educate them on the pitfalls, give them some examples of what hasn't worked well and the ramifications of that. And it's been so eye-opening. I think many, it's funny. I've had some research coordinators, when I give examples, say, people really, they do that? And, because they can't always go to the dark side of somebody using that kind of information in a not beneficial way. So we found that's really powerful, and sets the stage from the get-go, so that everyone sort of has those goalposts, because what we're trying to do is really hard, and patients need it. And so we don't want anything to happen to jeopardize the mission.
Right. And I mean, it's like anything else in healthcare. Informed patients. The more informed a patient is for the care they're getting, the better. The more informed a patient is in a clinical trial, the better. I mean, it's just kind of, it's certainly not a new topic in healthcare, but I think with the onset of just constant communication, patients are just getting more informed about those kind of things, and I think this is just an extension of that, which is great.
And it sounds like for the most part, I think, like they're not skeptical towards, that viewpoint. Like they're like, okay, oh, I see how this could, impact the trial, et cetera, and kind of give responses like, oh, people would actually do that. It's good that you can kind of, through education, bring people to your side and see, like, it's not that we don't want you to, like, say things. We know that a clinical trial, there's going to be a range of, symptoms and et cetera, but ultimately it's going to hurt the whole mission rather than just, really saying what's going on with your particular case. So it's good, I think. I mean, education is key, right? If you educate someone, I think they're more likely to come to your side and ultimately understand, the bigger goal.
Like I tell my children, there's a big difference between don't do this and don't do this because.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
Once you add that because, people can process the information and say, you got it, as opposed to just automatically saying, well, you can't tell me what to do. I think it's important in all walks of life. So shifting gears a little bit, so talking about patient communities and how they relate to research trials. So that's always had a big in-person component, obviously. And for the past 18 months, in-person components have been a huge no-no, which we understand. But we're kind of starting to come out of that now, and we're starting to see in-person connections starting to happen again. But in-person connections, though great for large elements of the rare disease community, not always accessible to everyone. So I think some of the technology that we're taking, some of the improved video conferencing, and those kind of things that the pandemic has spurned are actually going to be a boon for these patient communities for which
Definitely.
travel and in-person was never really an option.
Yeah.
So, Theresa, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that and how you think that that's going to evolve those communities now that we've all gotten so better at knowing where the camera button on our laptops are and remembering to unmute ourselves.
Unmute. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I would say from the dawn of technology enabling these communities to come together online, they've been used to that for a long time, particularly because patient group communities are spread so far apart, particularly in rare diseases. You find your counterpart halfway across the world dealing with the same things you are. So in that regard, I think connecting online is not a new concept, particularly for disease areas where patients are unable to travel, as you said, whether it's their condition or it's just too much. So I think what's happened in this past year is that that has come to a whole other level in their connecting, that their events for those that could travel, and many of these patient advocacy organizations do have annual events, whether it's family days or summer camps or the in-person connection you can never discount, and so I think I've had patients and patient advocacy groups say, I can't believe I wait all year for this one event and I haven't been able to go this year.
I can imagine.
So some of the organizations have tried to do a virtual live event, if you will. And those have worked well, but I think that this hybrid approach is here to stay,
Right.
And particularly in healthcare. So I think it's been great.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, what are some things, so Elise and I are on the production side of that for these kind of events. What are kind of things that she and I and our colleagues here at Kramer need to be aware of? Like how is it maybe hosting a virtual or a hybrid event for a patient community different at all from what we do for some of our corporate clients per se? I'm just curious if there's anything we need to be aware of, stuff we can do better.
Definitely a different landscape just in terms of everything, especially the goal. So that would be great to know.
Yeah, so it is different. And as I mentioned, you really have to take a patient-centric view of the event, right? What are their language barriers? Because you're bringing people together, globally, and I know that relates to other industries as well. But there's also potential cognitive challenges. So their ability to participate? Is the event too long? Are they going to lose?
Accessibility.
Right. I know our attention spans in general today are quite short, but I think in some of these disease areas, they're not even aware of that. So you need to be aware of that. You need to talk to caregivers to understand what the challenges are even before you do the event. I think there's also mobility challenges. So, is there, and connectivity challenges, all of those things. So when contemplating a hybrid event, how do you make it the experience as good for those that are able to attend live, as good as, or in some instances, maybe even better experience for those that can't be in person. And I would say the other thing is being able to keep them connected before, during, and after the event. And I know Kramer's actually done that quite well across industries, but it's particularly a challenge in the healthcare space.
So a big part of the value of social media is this kind of immediate back and forth you can get with companies or institutions that were traditionally not available to us. I can write Coca-Cola and say, I love Coca-Cola, and they can write back, or I hate Coca, and you get, it's obviously not necessarily the CEO of the company, but you feel like you have some kind of connection to the brands that you're associating with online.
Yeah.
And I think that's very helpful for both customer and producer. Not always so easy to do in social media,
Sure.
when it comes to healthcare. So, Theresa, I'm kind of curious if you can, what is it like when people are throwing, very personal questions or very broad statements out there on the internet? And, how do companies like Homology respond to that? Or are you even able to respond to that? What does that back and forth look like in this industry?
I'm so glad you asked that question because it is really frustrating for companies in this space. We talked a bit about the Hipaa regulations, patient confidentiality. Companies can't even say whether or not that's a patient, that's not a patient. First of all, in many instances, we don't really know because the social media is not always who you think it is that is actually posting.
So someone could be posing as a patient when they are truly not a patient for whatever reason. Yeah, just stirring the pot as it is. Wow. Okay.
That absolutely happens. It happens among competitive, therapeutic areas. Companies buying for the same, therapy and development. So it becomes a sometimes misused tool. But I think once people, and I put all people in that, patients, caregivers, principal investigators, reporters, investors, you name it. Once they understand that the company cannot respond, I think then it's a real eye-opener. It's not that we don't want to. It's not that we're just unable to. There's regulations in place that prohibit our responding, particularly in a forum like social media.
That's super eye-opening to me, because that totally makes sense, because you can't track if that person is a part of, et cetera, et cetera. But I think from the public standpoint or the reverse, I can see how a lot of big public things.
It seems like the company is uncaring when it's
Correct,
actually we care too much to comment because we can't jeopardize what we're doing.
Which is such a switch usually, because usually people have to make statements. But yeah, that's super eye-opening and a good thing to know.
I think the other thing that patients and families sometimes think is that, oh, well, this is my private group. This is just the patients like me. I'm just sharing it with these small people. Well, I'm not small people, that's the wrong word, but this small group of people, right? And it then they don't realize that, you know, I can see sometimes people on groups that I know aren't who they say they are. So that's eye-opening too. You know, wait, somebody's in my group or somebody in my group is then taking this information and just emailing it or putting it on the internet, or it no longer is contained within the community at which they're trying to help.
Yeah, it's a sad commentary, but I think an important one to remember is that nothing on the internet is ever truly private, no matter how much you like it to be or you think you can trust. I think that there is that golden rule. What is it? Don't put anything online you wouldn't say to your grandmother, I think.
Or that you wouldn't want to be there forever.
Yes.
Or as we say in communications, or on a billboard on the interstate.
Yep.
I think for me, and this is not relevant specifically to healthcare, but I think it is more so relevant in that kind of trying to shift the mindset of this is our singular event. It happens in June. It happens on this date. That's our event. And for me now, the idea is you're still having that event in June, but the event itself is now going to start 3 months prior and extend 2 months afterwards because you're just sharing all that different content. Thinking of events more in the lungs of a communication continuum as opposed to a tentpole. And I think for communities like this, where interacting with each other is so vitally important, that's just going to actually enrich that experience even more than in other industries you're seeing. Just as the end users become more comfortable with consuming content that way, companies or healthcare organizations become more comfortable distributing information that way. And then production companies such as us get better at finding more efficient ways to do that. It's all going to come together in a really great convergence, I believe. I'm hopeful anyway.
And things just coming together because I think, something that Tripp and I have been talking a lot about is it's not just, like you said, your event. It's the content that you're posting before to help people understand leading up and post. And I think you said that as well, Theresa. So it's really great, I think, especially in terms of this audience, like that information and that curve and being able to, extend and, lead up to everything is vital. It's not just a good strategy. Like it's actually really vital for these communities.
And it gives you more time to do it too.
Yeah.
The old ways of, this is our theme, this is our brain. It's kind of compressed in a short amount of time. If you have time to say, well, this is our vibe for this event, and it kind of evolves organically and naturally over time, it becomes of better value to the people using it. So I think that it just allows growth and expansion in a way that you did not get when things were on a set day or weekend.
Correct.
Which is great. It's great. Well, Theresa, we're not going to take up any more of your time. This has been a fascinating conversation. Appreciate you educating us and our listeners. So, thank you so much for giving us all this info.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation and being able to educate folks on a much wider scale through this effort. So thank you very much, Tripp and Elise. I appreciate it.
It's great information. We're glad to get it out there.
Nice to meet you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
That was great.
As someone who doesn't work in the healthcare community a lot, that was really educational. Because I think for us, it's often like, how are we going to get these people to pay attention? How are we going to get these audiences to engage? But it sounds like, specifically to healthcare, even just like having that buy-in of like these people want to be here. They're really engaged. So it's just like, now let's give them a good experience. It's just a very different, I think, way.
It's different barriers to entry.
For sure.
In some of the events that we do, the idea is how can we get people to pay attention? How can we get them to care enough to log on? And then once they log on, how can we change things fast enough to deal with their attention span? All that, valid problems, but problems very specific. This industry, it's
like a flip.
It's a flip. How can we make sure we're reaching the right people? And then once we have them, how can we give them enough content to be valuable, but not too much content because you're so restricted in what you can talk
Sure.
about.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you have on one side a more engaged audience with less content that you're able to do, as opposed to some traditional things we do where we have too much content to actually engage people. So
Yeah.
an interesting problem.
Yeah.
But like we talked about with Theresa, I think this idea of thinking about it in a broader communication campaign or spectrum or whatever the word you want to use is great, because that allows you to just smaller hits to touch base and then just more communication points, gives you more data, more metrics to work with. So you're always building towards a bigger and better event or connection next time, which is super valuable healthcare otherwise.
Definitely, definitely. Like we say always, thank you to our listeners, and thank you for watching another episode of Pivot Points.
Talk to you soon.